You guys, I can't even condemn you because I'll be judging you, but no judgment on my side, Trudy. You do a wonderful job and I see your parenting and grandparenting skills. They are awesome. And thank you for the story. She only heard about that late last night. There was a bit of a mix-up with what was happening. I was on standby and there was someone else on standby as well. But Trudy came up and shared an excellent story because that is the essence of our message today. So we're going through the book of Matthew and we're up to chapter 8. And I was blown away when I looked at chapter 8 and knew we were doing communion and just was blown away how the two messages really meet beautifully. And I want to share with some of that with you today. But doing a little bit of revision, we find that 3 weeks ago, we started on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, on the acts of his preaching. And in chapter 5, we found the attitude that we should have. In chapter 6, we looked at our motives and what drives us to do what we do. And chapter 7, we looked at judging and not judging. How do you people feel to put up your hands? It's just a little while ago. And so we looked at the overall picture of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And certainly we've discovered that prayer is certainly a key element, and praying for the Holy Spirit and also praying for wisdom, so we don't do the acts that we find a lot of the people doing back in those days, that had the wrong motives, that were judging others and that did not have the right attitude. So we found it very important to ask, to seek and to knock. And the chapter finished with people being astonished at his teachings because he was one who taught with authority. And they were blown away by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Well, chapter 8, I should say, begins not with Jesus' preaching, but Jesus' actions. And I always try and tell the children in my care that actions are far more important than words. I have them come to me and I say, I'm sorry, well, can you do this? No, I can't do it. Well, I'm afraid you're not really sorry because your actions show that you're not sorry. But Jesus showed through his actions that he was doing exactly what he advocated in the Sermon on the Mount. And we find that in chapter 8 to 9, we have 12 miracles jammed into 2 chapters in Matthew. And it's interesting that when you look at these 12 miracles, it's like they're strategically put in place to reveal one main overall theme. And that is that Jesus came to help those who couldn't help themselves. Jesus came to help those who couldn't help themselves. And really that is a beautiful thing. Overall in Matthew we see that so far that we've looked from chapter 1 through to chapter 4, and we see that Jesus is portrayed by Matthew as the promised son, fulfilling the covenant. Chapters 5 to 7, as we said, he comes as the preacher. Now we're up to the part where we see Jesus as a healer. And we see some healing of Jesus. We're going to see him as a leader and a teacher and a prophet and a conqueror as we go through our series on Matthew. But Matthew records events not in a chronological sense. In other words, the first miracle that we're going to see today, Mark actually puts it as happening before the Sermon on the Mount. And most scholars agree that it probably did happen before the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew doesn't use a chronological method of putting things together. He uses more of a methodological way of putting things together. In other words, he has a specific purpose in mind. He wants to show us a specific message. And Jesus, by each of his healings, he also wants us to get a message out of the way that he healed. We find that Jesus healed in many different ways. And when you read through some of the healings of Jesus, it's really good to ask yourself the question, why did he heal this way this person this way. Because you see that with people that were blind, sometimes he just said, your faith has healed you, go on your way. Other times he put mud on the eyes of the person and got them to wash, and what did they say? They saw things fuzzy. Then he had to do it again, and they saw things clearly. It wasn't Jesus having trouble with healing the person, it is more that Jesus was giving a specific message to the people around him. And so it's good to ask ourselves the question, why did Jesus heal this way? And we're going to find that Matthew records more than any other of the Gospels of Jesus healing by touch. Thank you, Tim. Awesome. Troy, was it? Yeah, so he heals by touch. Which we're going to see today, which is going to show us a specific message. So we find that his method in mind, I want to propose to you that he is trying to bring out two main thoughts. There's probably other thoughts he's trying to bring out as well, but he came to reveal that Jesus was the promised Messiah, that he was that promised seed that was spoken of back in the Old Testament. We talked about Matthew, how it just completely flows from one to the other. There's no old and new, it's the first and the second. The first and the second Testament. And we find that he reveals Jesus in Matthew 1 as, this is the genealogy of Jesus, who is the son of Abraham and the son of David. David. Son of Abraham, son of David. What is he trying to say by saying that? He is the promised son that was promised to Abraham. He was the seed that was promised to Abraham, and he is the kingly son that was to come, that was to sit on David's throne. So here, when he starts straight off by saying these things. And we're going to see that in Matthew 8, that Jesus is actually fulfilling the role that was promised back in Genesis 12 and verse 3. What does Genesis 12 and verse 3 tell us? That all nations of the earth will be blessed through whose seed? Abraham's seed. And the seed was singular, meaning Jesus. So it tells us there that in Genesis 12 and verse 3, that when Jesus comes through the line of Abraham, that he will bless all nations. All nations will be blessed through him. And Matthew reveals now, in this passage in chapter 8, that all nations are actually being blessed through Jesus. So that's one thing I believe he's trying to bring out through this passage. The second thing that I'd like to share is that he came to reveal that Jesus is both Creator and Redeemer. He's both Creator and Redeemer. Now in verse 3, let's have a look at that. We find, and we're going to come back to this. By the way, we're not going to do the whole of the chapter. There's not enough time to do the whole of the chapter. I think we could probably do about 5 sermons on this one chapter. So we're going to focus more on the very first one. But we find there in that healing, we find that Jesus touched him, but he didn't become clean until he said what? Be cleansed. When he said those words, when he spoke those words, he was clean. Later on we find that a centurion came to him and asked for his servant to be healed. And Jesus said, I will come and heal your servant. And he said, no, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. Just speak the words. Just say the words and my servant will be healed. And so Jesus did just speak and he was healed. What the centurion was, in fact, I believe, saying was, I believe that you spoke things into existence so you can just speak it and it will happen. You know, I've got servants under me that I just say do this and do that and they do it. You can just speak the word and it will happen. So we find in verse 8 that Jesus spoke and it actually happened. In verse 16 we find, in the last part of verse 16, and he cast out spirits with a word. and he healed all who were sick. He healed all who were sick. Troy, do you mind if I turn this on off here? Thanks. All right. So we find that Matthew is bringing out that by Jesus just speaking, it will happen. Reminding us of Jesus when he created the world, he spoke things into existence. By his word, there is power in his word. And so we find that he is the creator, and also in verse 16 and 17 it reveals that he is the redeemer through taking upon himself the sin of the world. And we're going to see that, and that also goes back to Isaiah chapter 53. But let's have a look at the first two verses in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 8, and it says in verse 1. When he had come down from the mountain... Matthew chapter 8. Did I say something else? Matthew chapter 8 and verse 1. When he came down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Here we find that Jesus speaks to this leper. But before he speaks to this leper came to him. Now I want to try and put this in perspective for us here today. Leprosy in those days was considered worse than coronavirus today. By the way, I'm looking out on the people here, and it's not looking like a lot of social distancing. Maybe you're all from the same house, I hope so. But back when they discovered they had leprosy, they would need to go to the priest, and the priest would check them the first time, and if they weren't sure, then they would isolate them for 14 days. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Isolate them for 14 days. They would come back to the priest would check them again, and if they had leprosy and they lived in a walled city, they would be cast out of town. They would be taken out, and the family would sometimes go out with them, set up a little hut for them where some other lepers might be, and leave some food for these people. And from that point of time on, they would have no contact with anybody. Not in their house, not anywhere. And if someone came along that came close to them, they were to call out, unclean, unclean. And people would divert way around them. And they'd divert a lot more than 1.5 metres, let me tell you. What was going on in a person's mind that had leprosy? What was going on in that person's mind? I want to tell you, it must have been an awful recipe for depression, and certainly a lot of other illnesses. Because they were isolated, they couldn't come near anybody, they were classed as unclean, but more than anything, they were classed as unclean because they had sinned. Thank you, Yvonne. Because they had sinned. So we find that back in those days, the thoughts were that if you had an ailment, you had sinned that caused that ailment. There was one time when the disciples come along and they said to Jesus, this guy over here that was born blind, how did that happen? Because was it his parents' sin or his own sin? And Jesus said, let's not worry about blaming. Let's just fix that person. And so their concept was that if they had some sort of ailment, then they had sinned. And let me tell you, if they had got leprosy, that was basically one of the worst ailments they could have. Not only were they isolated, but this disease would show on the outside, but it would also start to eat the flesh on the inside. And it would be a slow, horrible death. A slow, horrible death of isolation, where they couldn't be with their loved ones. And as the time went on, the family would sometimes drop food in an area and then go away, and they would come over to this area to have food. But then as they got worse, there'd be less and less visits. And that person would be very isolated. So here in these verses we read that this leper came to Jesus. We also read that there was large crowds there following them. So knowing now this background, and we put ourselves in the picture, can you imagine what the crowd was doing? As this man was coming towards Jesus, I can just imagine this crowd starting to separate and saying, "What are you doing? Go away." Could they notice a leper? They certainly could. A leper had to have his clothes torn, he had to not comb his hair, he had to cover his beard. Everyone knew what a leper looked like. And this guy, as he's coming towards Jesus, I can just imagine the crowds, just dispersing and yelling at this guy to get away, get away. And as he comes closer and closer, he gets down on his knees and he worships God. And he says, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." So he knows that Jesus has the power to make him clean. He knows that Jesus has the power to change his whole outlook. And he asks, "If you can, please do it. If it is your will, if it's within your will, I want it to happen." And so he says, "You can make me clean." What is Jesus' response? Jesus' response in verse 3, it tells us, Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately the leprosy was cleansed. So Jesus says, what does he do? What does he do first? He touches him. He doesn't speak yet, he touches him. He reaches out and touches him. Can you imagine the crowd? What does that mean? What does that mean for Jesus? He is now infected. He is now infected. He's come in too close a contact, and not only has he touched, but he must be now infected. By the way, the word clean has both a physical and a moral meaning. And the word for clean, when he asked to be clean, it is more likely and is used more often in the Bible as the moral meaning rather than the physical meaning. So what this guy was actually asking for was not physical cleaning, but cleaning on the inside, as Trudy spoke about. He was asking for that inside to be fixed up because he was carrying so much guilt about his sin being so bad because he has this ailment, and he wants that cleanness on the inside. And by Jesus touching him, what does he reveal? When we look at the word for touch, it is not just a coming over here and going, just in case he's got COVID. This word for touch is to actually cling to. So it shows here that Jesus actually clinged to this man. Also, this same word is used by Jesus himself when Mary, after he had risen, Mary was holding on to him. And Jesus says, "Don't cling to me because I have not yet ascended to my Father." So Jesus wasn't afraid of the disease. Why not? Because he knew that he had to take on that disease to purify him. How do I know that? Well, let's go back over to verse 16 and 17. Verse 16 says, "When evening had come, they had brought many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out spirits with a word, and he healed all who were sick." What does he say? What does Matthew say? That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, he himself took our infirmities and bore our sickness. Jesus knew to cleanse this guy, and he wanted to show everybody else, to cleanse this guy, he himself had to be infected. He himself had to take on their infirmities. In verse 6 of the same chapter it says, "The Lord has laid on him," him being Jesus, "the iniquity of us all. In other words, he's being infected by touching to cleanse you and I. And this is the message that Matthew wants us to see here, that Jesus is not afraid of being infected to cleanse you and I here today. In these first three healings we find the untouchables, the lepers, the Gentiles through the centurions, and women who were marginalised in those days are all the ones that are healed. Here in this passage, in this same passage, in verse 10 it says, "When Jesus heard it, he marvelled and said," this is about the faith of the centurion. "He marvelled and said, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel." What we need to be healed is faith in the fact that Jesus is the healer. That Jesus has become infected with your sin to be able to heal you. And he says, "I have not found such great faith even in Israel, and I say unto you, many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness." So it's telling us here that we are healed not because of who we are, not because our connection, our bloodlines, not because we are Seventh-day Adventists, not because we keep the Sabbath day holy, or we do this or we do that. We are healed because we have faith in the healer who is come. This service today is a service that represents that. You know, it's a shame that we can't yet do foot washing, because foot washing reveals this washing away of sin. I encourage you to read John 13, the account there where foot washing was instigated by Jesus with his disciples, which reveals that was a process. If we had sin in our lives, that was a way of getting rid of it. And we come to this service knowing that Jesus has taken on our sin so he can cleanse us and renew us. So this service that we're partaking of today is a service that is a celebration service. It's a time to be happy for what Jesus has done and to acknowledge that. What Matthew is wanting us to know today is that Jesus, who did that for those people back there, wants to do that for you and I here today. Matthew wants us to know that the creator of this world, who spoke things into existence, wants to recreate you anew through himself. Matthew 3, which is our key text, is telling us that Jesus is willing. He is willing to cleanse us. And Matthew 7, what we studied last week, reminds us that Jesus does invite us to continue to ask, continue to seek and continue to knock, and to continue to realise that He is the healer, and that He wants to cleanse you and I here today. So as we partake of this service, and I want to invite Dan to come up and sing this song as the elders come up, let's remember that He is the healer that offers us cleansing by taking on the sin of Himself so we can be clean. Thank you.
I'd invite you to sing with us. It's Amazing Grace. My chains are gone.